The classic, Super Metroid. Now, I titled my videos So I Finally Played, since the whole idea was to play through a whole series of games, game by game, including ones I had never played before. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I have played Super Metroid several times. This game is not new to me. In fact, this is one of my dad's favorites. It is a classic that holds up surprisingly well, and its influences on gaming in general are generally well known. I will likely not have anything new to say about this game, as people much smarter and more thorough than myself have already attempted to explain in full detail why this game is a masterpiece. That said, I think this game is an important one to address, and I think it's important to point out where this stands for me personally. Now, while not completely warranted, I think, I compared the first Metroid to the original Zelda. It's a clunky pioneer that helped establish an entire genre of games that we still play today. And I compared the second one to the second Zelda, being kind of an odd outlier that definitely influenced future entries, but still kind of stands on its own as kind of an odd sequel to the original game. So going back to this original comparison, this game is Metroid's A Link to the Past. Many people consider it their all-time favorite Metroid game, and many people consider it an absolute masterpiece. The world is masterful, the progression is steady and direct, it is open-ended but done in a way that guides you so you don't feel completely lost and confused. The action in this game takes the world and style of the original Metroid and combines it with the quality of life changes that were added in the sequel, and then combines them with more fluid movement, jumping, shooting, etc. This game, I think, is where the series really hits its stride. Interestingly enough, though, I never noticed this as a kid. I took a lot of the quality of life improvements for granted. In fact, it wasn't even until much later that I even realized that this was the third in the series. Part of it, I think, was the name of the game. It's called Super Metroid. And Nintendo always does this, just like Wii Sports and the like. They love to name games based on the console they release on. And I'm honestly surprised that Metroid Prime wasn't Metroid Cube or some stupid shit like that. Then again, no offense to Nintendo, but they've always been pretty stupid about their naming systems. For instance, having an entire series named after a princess who isn't even in half the games. It is what it is. I'll end my rant there before I go too far, but Metroid kind of follows suit. The point is, as a kid watching my dad play this game, I always thought of Super Metroid as the Metroid game, and this is the one I knew or cared about. It was the only one I knew or cared about. It was my first Metroid game myself, and inevitably the baseline for my comparison when reviewing other entries in the series. A lot of the series' evolution was completely lost to me, as I had not seen the clumsiness of the earlier games. Seriously though, everything about this game is far better than its predecessors. As previously mentioned, they combined the improvements in 2 with the level design in 1. They added a fucking map, more on that later. The storytelling, both direct and indirect, is vastly improved. The music, per usual, was amazing. Honestly, just the ability to aim diagonal is a huge improvement that dramatically affects the overall sense of control and flow of the game. Combine that with the ability to aim down and crouch from Metroid 2, and the game just feels miles above its previous entries. The movement is much more fluid and controlled than either of the first 2 games. Let me back up, though. In healthcare, we have this thing called a head-to-toe assessment. It's not super relevant to video games, but the point is that we assess from the head, level of consciousness, airway, neurological symptoms, etc., and work our way down to the toes. Again, not necessarily super applicable when the patient is a video game, but I think we can use the same principle, and so I'm going to start with the opening. The series, up to this point, has had phenomenal opening title screens. In fact, I feel like I can honestly say that they are my favorite part of each game individually. In the very least, they are some of the most intentional and well-polished sequences so far. And this game, from its very opening sequence, does not disappoint. It perfectly blends the thick, somber tune of the original with the atmospheric background noise and screech is heard in the second one. The result is a truly unsettling opening. Combine this with the jump cuts and the whole thing comes together perfectly. It starts slow, building, the camera slides across the abandoned lab, it shows dead bodies, it shows the Metroid, and then the title is iconic and a perfect example of what the series is all about. It brings me to a point I've only touched on a little bit in the previous videos. Metroid is essentially a horror series. Granted, it's not really what we think of when we imagine horror games in general, But that's because it was a pioneer of its own genre. It's taking horror in a different direction than other games have, while being completely family-friendly. It's trying to be scary, but without gore, at least for the most part. I won't rehash the previous games, but just consider the opening in this game. You have the title, you have the opening cutscene, but once you start the game, you are responding to a distress call. When you arrive, everything is dead silent. You experience no conflict as you walk through the seemingly abandoned research facility. Almost all the power is off, you hear vague noises of alarm bells, you walk past damage and dead bodies, you are forced to walk past where we know the baby Metroid was previously located and currently see it missing. All before you experience an unwinnable boss fight, and it ends with a timed escape sequence in which the research facility blows up. If that is not enough, consider the first section of the main game, when you first land on the planet you spend the majority of the game on. You slowly walk past several areas you could remember from the first game. The music is quiet and somber, chilling. You see vague hints of life, but nothing major. Bugs crawl away as you walk past. You trail past the abandoned laboratory that used to house Mother Brain's remains. Again, no conflict. The area is abandoned and quiet, and when you reach the start of the game, your only clue to danger is the new security camera that observes you when you re-obtain the morph ball. On that note, I don't know how you actually lost it after the second game, but whatever, I won't get into that. When danger finally does arrive, the music takes a massive shift in tone. It shrieks at you, alerting you to the new threat. Enemies are crawling about, and from here on, you will have to fight to survive. It might not be a traditional horror experience, and it definitely leans more towards what gamers consider action, but I think the developer's intent is very clear, and I think that this should be considered when you view the rest of these games. This is not a whimsical action-adventure. These games are supposed to be heavy, at least compared to the games of its time, and certainly for Nintendo games. The enemy placement, especially bosses, is another indicator of this. The number of times the series utilizes surprise boss fights or slow tension-building intros and forces you to walk through quiet spaces to build up suspense, I think these games should be considered as mild horror games, and I promise you will have much more appreciation for them if you view them this way. As far as actual gameplay goes, though, this game is the best so far. As previously mentioned, the ability to aim up, diagonal, down, along with crouching is huge. It makes you feel much more in control and no longer feels like you're trying to work around the game. No offense to the first two games in the series, but the limitations often made it feel like your biggest enemy was the game itself. The controller was not your friend. In Super Metroid, not as much. The environment feels dangerous, bosses are concerning, but inability to move where you want to is not a problem. Health stations are back, but this time as an actual part of the environment rather than a random orb that just helps you. Everything connects to your arm cannon, which is has weird connotations for the universe, and the Chozo in general, actually, but I'm not going to get too much into that. Along with the health stations are missile stations to replenish your weapons, and then a new one, map stations. Like I said before, the map is huge, and if you've watched my previous videos on the series, you already know my opinion. I hate getting aimlessly lost. Having played through both previous games with and without a map, it is my strong preference to have a map. The game introduces this one nicely too. In unexplored areas, you only fill in the map as you go, seeing where you've been and haven't been before. That is, until you reach a map room. Once you download the map, you now have a basic skeleton of the map, but it still remains unfilled, and it fills in as you progress, allowing you to easily see where you have been before and where you need to go. This, I think, is essential to Metroidvanias, and I think most people agree, as most Metroidvanias include a map themselves. Like I said, this is just a personal opinion, but for me, it is not fun to wander aimlessly around in search of the path forward. I like having a basic direction and guidance, and then being allowed to wander off or find my own solution. The map allows me to see which general direction I need to go, or at least gives me an idea of where my goal is. How I approach this, then, is entirely up to me, and I have control over this. If I want to go explore at a seemingly secret area first, I am completely free to do so, and I know exactly what I'm getting into, or at least in general. I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot here, but as previously stated, this was my first Metroid game, so I've not really played the Metroidvanias without a map, and to me it is a key part of the formula that makes them work the way they do. Without a map, and without guidance, this game would have been frustrating, and finding secrets would have devolved into a tedious process of trial by error. This vital evolution of the formula, I think, truly set the standard for this genre and allowed it to thrive. This might sound harsh, but hear me out. Honestly, I kind of think the intention of this game was to correct and perfect the attempt at their first game. Considering the fact that this takes place on the exact same map, at least for the most part, and you adventure through most of the same areas you experienced in the first game, You fight a lot of the same bosses, but bigger and more powerful, plus several new ones to pad things out. The Zelda-like progression is further perfected here, filled with invisible tutorials to gently get the player used to new abilities and standards prior to gaining the power-up and then after gaining them. Slowly but somewhat linearly opening up new areas to explore. This is much more direct and effective than either of the first two games, and it gives more of an appearance of an open world, but silently guides the player into intentionally finding each consecutive area and subsequent power-up. True, there are still a number of Metroid moments where the path forward is needlessly unintuitive, and there are some objectives that are hidden behind what feels like a secret. For instance, I still think Kraid's lair is a little bit of a weird one. Not everything flows perfectly, but for the most part the game feels very intentional and reasonable. There is a lot more variety in this game. Kind of. Granted, most of the areas are still some variation of caves and caverns, but everything feels a little more distinct this time. Besides, the small subdivisions give enough variety to give it more life. We have jungle areas, caves, swamps, a haunted ship, research facilities, etc. It's not that diverse compared to other games of this genre, or even in this series, but for its time it was very impressive, and I think it still holds up pretty well today. Now the plot. Up to this point, Metroid has not been particularly big on plot, at least not necessarily. We see some background setups in the instruction booklets, but the games themselves usually are only a couple sentences worth of plot. Much more of the plot is told through passive storytelling and in the background, and more have implications to the setup than anything else. This game shakes things up a little bit.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
For instance, there's an actual opening sequence and cutscenes. You no longer need an instruction booklet to understand anything related to the game. We can now know exactly what's happening simply by playing the game. That is nice, although I have a mild complaint about the intro. For me, it kind of undermines the ending of Metroid 2. My interpretation of Metroid 2 is that you were tasked with slaughtering an entire species, but Samus couldn't bring herself to kill a literal newborn, so instead she took it with her, abandoning her genocidal mission, and is kind of a sweet ending to a grim setup, accented perfectly with cheerful, hopeful music as you left the planet behind, when just seconds ago you were slaughtering everything you could. The intro of Super Metroid immediately undercuts that ending, or at least my interpretation of that ending. Samus openly admits to keeping the last of the species for research purposes. She delivers the Metroid to the research facility and leaves to, quote, hunt another bounty. In other words, this was just a job. She completed said job and decided to move on. It doesn't really carry half the weight that I interpreted from the ending of the second game. She isn't soulless, though. She does show some excitement from the initial findings of the research, and this shows that she does genuinely seem invested in the good of the galaxy, and is doing what she thought was best, not just, going after a paycheck. Still, I found the setup to be a little disconnected when compared to the previous entries, and it's something I didn't really notice before as I had not played the first two games prior to playing this game. The rest of the plot follows the typical Metroid style of storytelling, which is more showing instead of telling, which is, for the record, something we praise in writing. Video games should be the same, I think. The atmospheric layering here is phenomenal. I mean, I just talked about how they utilized horror. Those same images should tell you how good this game is at setting the tone and telling a story. When you arrive to the planet, it is quiet, abandoned, chilling. This is an uncomfortable experience. You are walking through the remnants of a battleground. And when the enemies do show up, the old battle continues, and so you kind of know what you were getting into. Now, from a storytelling point of view, the Metro games usually reach a very slow and drop-down point in actual plot. At some point, plot progression takes a backseat, and exploration and combat kind of become the main focus of the game. Like before, you are hunting down space pirate generals and killing them to unlock a secret lab, which still seems like a really weird lock mechanic. I don't really know how they managed to pitch that one successfully, but whatever, the space pirates are weird. One thing to note, though, is that the environments themselves contain something of a story in and of itself. Take the haunted ship, for instance. There's no power, and the save room that you first walk in is no longer a safe space that it usually is. It lets you know that things are different here, and intense. And then there are literal ghosts. I don't know what the implications those have on the universe, but I don't like it, and I'm uncomfortable. Throughout the rest of the series, the plot kind of evolves much like the first game. You find the hidden lair, you find out that they are, in fact, replicating Metroids, and you slaughter said Metroids, like you did in the first game. The one thing that does change here is a giant Metroid attacks you and starts to drain your life before stopping at the last moment, and you realize that this was the larva that you had just saved. It comes back later to save your life as a new and improved Mother Brain is kicking your ass and sacrifices itself to save you and gives you the Hyper Beam, which allows you to wipe out Mother Brain, and then the entire bloody fucking planet blows up, which that just kind of makes sure that they will not attempt this plot device again, and you will not be revisiting this planet. A second time is the charm, and they won't do it again. Like I said, after the setup, not a whole lot happens as far as plot goes, but these events will ripple through the rest of the series and be quite important. It still seems like a kind of shift in tone from the first two games, but I think it works fairly well, and honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed this game. Even the escape sequence is nice, and the option to go back and save the animals is something I didn't even know existed as a kid. It's something that's just a nice little touch here. Having played Fusion, and honestly, since Fusion is my favorite game, I already know what the implications of this ending are, but I will discuss that in the future video. As far as this game goes, this is still a masterpiece. I think it really holds up today. Yes, it's a little bit clunky by today's standards, but not that much. You can thoroughly enjoy it, and I am very, very picky about old games. You should know this by now by seeing my previous videos. I think this is a very solid entry, and even my kids, they are 4 and 6, they really love this game. They enjoy watching it, they were very invested, and they're excited to see further entries in this series. I really think that this one is as close to a masterpiece as we will get. It created several series staples that are replicated in future entries, and honestly, I don't have many complaints other than some of the weird level design choices. I thoroughly enjoyed it, I highly recommend it, and you can easily play it on the Switch's online subscription, and we'll see how well that service continues to evolve. But for now, I definitely think it's worth a try, and something you should absolutely play before playing Dread, which is dropping fairly soon at this point. So I'm going to jump straight into Fusion, we're going to figure the rest of this out, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. You all have a great day. I'll see you next time. Bye!